I just decided it's the moment to change up what I'm going to read. So, Tim, you won't have to hear exactly the same thing again. I thank you so much for putting this on, for the invitation, Howard, and for the kind introduction. And thanks to my fellow readers. I think that introduction set up this book pretty well. I taught in rural Mississippi from 2002 to 2004 in the Delta, which is the alluvial floodplain of the Mississippi. So it's a geographical feature. It's the poorest and blackest part of the poorest and blackest state in the nation. Something like 80% African American. Whites still own 95% of the land and businesses. There's virtually no economy. And so it's a place where the legacy of King Cotton is still strong, and where the schools, even right now, I just returned there, are segregated today, and have been segregated since '71, when the Supreme Court said you had to actually enforce Brown v. Board, and private white academies popped up all over the Delta. I'm going to read from a chapter that's sort of the center of the book for me, that's very near and dear to my heart. And I just folded my book in 19 ways trying to get through this, so we'll see how I do. And then I'm going to read one late section of the book from the end. Oh, I should set this up and say, Felicia Jackson, the young lady here, who you can see on the cover of this book, which is why I chose it, and what I mean is this could be her, was an audacious little girl who I taught my second year, and who was a genius in IQ level, and had a pretty difficult home life. And the first day of class, when I asked her to do something, she stood on top of her desk and rapped the entire lyrics to the song that goes from the window to the wall, till the sweat drop. Anyway. And so suffice to say that she was difficult. I began to collect Felicia Jackson tales. Stories echoed and amplified, creating new tales, each wilder than the last. Felicia had climbed a gutter to the roof and threatened to jump unless the cafeteria served catfish that day. No, she jumped from the roof, but then they'd found her catfish and driven it from a county over, but they were out of hush puppies, so she jumped anyway. But at the hospital, they'd declared her without a scratch. No. She jumped from the roof into the middle of a panicked crowd of staff and children who closed their eyes screaming, but in midair she vanished, transformed into a crow that flew away cackling, "Fools." She threatened the life of her second-grade teacher with a pair of scissors. She'd stabbed her teacher with the scissors, causing her to lose a kidney. She'd cut her teacher's throat with a butcher knife and stood over her as she bled to death on the tile floor of the classroom, and they ruled it an accident. She'd broken a boy's fingers by slamming them in a door. No. She'd bitten off his fingers, including the thumb, with her razor-sharp teeth. No, that wasn't it. She'd stamped the boy's hands under her shoe in a fit of pique until there was nothing left. She told the superintendent to go to hell. She told the superintendent to F himself in the ass. She told the superintendent she'd kill his family and feed the bodies to the flesh-eating rats that she kept as pets in home, though nobody knew where she lived, how she lived. Perhaps she was from hell itself. That had to be it. At the root of each story, there seems some verifiable event. For example, one time they'd sent her to alternative school suspension under a one-woman supervision, and that woman, who was framed for her toughness, had proved her too much to handle. In all versions of that story, she'd been sent back to school due to allegations of abuse that she'd made. It was the nature and cause of the abuse that changed. In one case, they said she'd blackened her own eye by running headfirst into a door. Another version had her methodically bruising her own arm black and blue with her bare hands. And the third suggested that she'd ridden the teacher so mercilessly, she'd broken her. And the woman had actually been beating the girl, had strangled her until someone dragged her off. The teacher had suggested it was justifiable, that they should have let her kill her. Another story I'd heard from a member of the office staff was that Felicia the previous year had screamed rape in Assistant Principal Winston's office, had thrown open the door with panicked eyes, her closed disheveled bra hanging from one strap, and so since then Winston would only deal with her when the door was open. What emerged was an extraordinary and violent defiance, a nature so ruthlessly oppositional it couldn't be mastered. I believed some of the stories. What I didn't understand was how to reconcile the tales with my experience of her. In the overlap between impossibility and impossibility, there had to be some truth that connected with the gentleness I could sometimes exact from her with a smile or a compliment. There was something about Felicia that was worthy of effort, and I was going to bring it out. And in some way I did, by telling a lie. That is to say, I drove her to her grandmother's house to tell her how badly Felicia had behaved, and when I saw where she lived, and what the circumstances were like, and what was going on, and how her grandmother was excited that a teacher had come, I lied, said she'd been excellently behaved. And after that, Felicia suddenly believed that I was on her side. From then on, Felicia's behavior was different. The change wasn't a shift in character. She could still be as vicious as ever, still searching for the madcap and naughty angle, the means to assert her dominance. It was simply that she turned all the force of her personality to pleasing me. Whatever had been accomplished when I sung her praises to her grandmother despite all her transgressions had formed a bond, the binding lines invisible but strong. She glanced toward me as she went into her usual aggression, an insult on her tongue, and bite it back. She grew used to thinking before she spoke, to speaking softer. What was ingrained retreated before a new habit of gentleness, a thirst for praise. She sat up straight each day in her chair, working furiously. I'd let her stay after school and talk, because I wanted to understand her life behind the school, at her grandmother's apartment, and on the streets on this side of town. What was it like to walk those dirt roads, to linger at the edges of those chain-link fences? What was the feel of the back alley and grass lot at mid-evening, the search for something bright in the coming dusk? She didn't tell me. Her stories were her own, and revealed more in what wasn't said than what was. Most of her writing concerned her baby brother Ladarius, her sickle cell baby, as she called him, who can't do nothing for himself but have these big brown eyes and this smile that let the sun come up at the edge of the sky, and who love his big sister who keep him safe. From this I understood she cared for her brother all afternoon, every afternoon. She spoke frequently of her mother, Mama, who go a lot to Clayfield and Jackson and Memphis because she got things to do, but who take me down to the beauty shop and get my hair waved like them actresses on TV so all the men gonna watch me. She demanded less of her mother than she asked of everyone else. She took what she got. Her life on the streets was there only in passing mention, in telling detail. Was down at them ball courts last night by Booker where they ain't no nets because them big dumb boys cut them down. That boy Pipe gonna look at me wrong talking about my brother slow. I need to leave that boy at home and bring what I got on over to Pipe. Pipe's so fat-headed and stupid he had forgot he the slow one in them slow classes for them kids who don't know they head from a melon and they right from their left. But I told him till he know. I was sure she told everyone until they knew. Just as I was sure that the more she told me, the more entry I gained into her life. She pushed against everything preemptively, anticipating the strike. Yet she wanted only to protect what little she had, hoping for a mother who'd be around to tell her how to be a woman, a life for her brother free from judgment. I could create a safe, bounded space, a place for her to be herself. The possibilities unfurled in my mind. She'd pass the grade. I'd get her a talented and gifted scholarship to summer programs. She'd write a college essay so good they'd pay her way and hold banquets in her honor. And years later, I'd sit with her at dinner in some cultured city at a fine restaurant with dark burnished wood and glittering chandeliers. She a young, successful woman and me grown into some easier life. And she'd thank me for what I'd done. And I'd say to her, "You did it yourself. It was always in you." And she'd smile and shake her head, biting back the disagreement that would have been there for a moment in a flash of her eyes. I invited Felicia to help me before class, and mornings came to have a dependable rhythm. Felicia would be there at the door waiting, would embrace me with sleep-loggy slowness, and together we would prepare the classroom. The daily schedule, the morning assignments had to go on the blackboard, and I needed to organize my lesson plans, collate worksheets, reread lesson objectives, be sure the student practice was available. Felicia began without a word. The floors needed sweeping and mopping, the rug vacuuming, every desk needed to be wiped free of fingerprints and pencil-lead smudges. This work was comforting, the rituals creating the day ahead, and too there was a satisfaction in working with Felicia, who threw herself into each task. Sometimes I'd stop and watch her at work, incredulous. There was no bristle now, nothing but dedication to what she'd been asked. She polished the floors until they shone. The desks stood in undeviating rows, the worksheets were neatly stacked. There was nothing she did without care, exactly as I wished. And sometimes she'd nod in the direction of a task she completed with special pride, say the spines of every book straight on the shelves, and blush with aw shucks thanks, her face aglow. Other mornings we'd talk of books that she was reading. She favored material too adult for her, had gotten her hands on Lois Lowry's more mature books, and S.C. Hinton's The Outsiders, which she loved more than anything. That's the way it go, Mr. Copperman. You got to fight. Ain't no room to do nothing else. I told her she'd missed the point, that the boys had been harmed by the violence. She scoffed and said, "So Johnny was supposed to stand by and let Pony Boy get hurt?" I said there was plenty of room to do a lot else, and she suffered my diatribes on the benefits of nonviolence with skepticism, waiting for me to finish before saying, "Well, that does sound nice, Mr. Copperman. Maybe that's how it is back in San Francisco." I'd say, no. That's how it was right here in Mississippi. This was where Dr. King made it all happen. And what happened to Dr. King? I blinked, and her eyes flashed a little, and she added quietly, And why it is them white children don't come up to this school, and then white folks have all that cotton and all them fine fancy houses? And I stood trying to think of what to say about the measured progress of history, the necessary sacrifices, the pace of possible change. Yep, that's what I thought. She liked best to talk about what she was going to do. When I finish up in this school and all them schools, I'm gonna go as far as I can. Gonna see the world, see an ocean with some palm trees. Gonna go to that Japan where your people come from and they eat with them little sticks. Some of my people, I said, laughing. Sure. Japan was a new development for her. Before she wanted to go to Spain, to Mexico, New York, the North Pole. Where else? She glanced out the window as if seeking direction and looked at me. Where you gonna go? I chuckled. You mean when I'm not teaching here anymore? It hadn't occurred to me she was aware I'd leave. In fact, it hadn't occurred to me in a while that I'd ever be anywhere else. She nodded once, her gaze on the world outside the window where the sun was just clearing the angled tin of the roofs. She was serious. I cleared my throat. Back out west? To San Francisco, Seattle, maybe Portland. Is it nice out there? She was still watching the sun, a hovering orb in the pale sky. It's really different. She looked at me, her gaze unusually piercing, and she spoke quietly. That sounds good. West. I let the direction be, turned back to the work at hand, and Felicia lingered at the window and returned to wiping desks. Some ideas didn't bear explanation, like how little elsewhere meant. The West was like London, the North Pole was to Japan, and San Francisco was to Spain. All were equally distant. One Monday, I arrived at school at 6:40 as usual. As I opened the hall door, I knew that something was different. And sure enough, there down the dark corridor, there was no Felicia. I listened to see if she'd gone to the water fountain or to the restroom. Nothing. The hall was still, the quiet palpable. In the room, I flicked on the lights, felt again the lack of company. Maybe she was sick. She'd never missed a day she wasn't suspended for, and it had been some months since she'd been in any sort of trouble. I went about the usual preparation, the schedule, the morning sheets, the graded work returned. Then I turned myself to the work she'd have done, cleaning the boards, vacuuming the reading rugs with a little manual vacuum, sweeping off the dust bunnies. Other kids began to arrive at 7:30, and I could see in each of them an immediate recognition of her absence. A searching gaze about the room, a puzzled nodding of the head before they went putting up their packs and lunches and getting to their work. I'd already marked her gone when the door flew inward, slammed once against a far wall and rested half open, and Felicia ducked her head about the jam, hair pulled in two neat red bows with two immaculate buns, as though she spent the entire morning tightening the knots just so. When she saw me, her face opened to her beaming, toothy grin, and I smiled back, honestly glad to see her. She stepped through the doorway with all eyes on her. Good morning, Felicia. She smiled even bigger, her eyes flashing impishly, and started forward, and then she jerked to a stop as if she'd come to the end of a cord binding her. The smile retreated, her expression suddenly unreadable, though turmoil was evident in her eyes, and she remained poised there, straining forward and being drawn back, and then she lifted an accusatory finger. Chinaman. She spat it out, each syllable twisting in her mouth in disgust, and then she bolted back through the door. I stood, as paralyzed as the class who regarded me with shock and recognition, as if waiting for me to don a straw boat hat and do unspeakable things. In the silence that followed, Felicia's footsteps pounded down the hall, then there was a ripping and tearing, and I hurried to the door. Miss Mason had Felicia by the elbow. On the floor was a pile of papers and posters, torn and tossed to the ground, ragged pieces of them still hanging from the wall. As Miss Mason steered her toward the office, Felicia twisted her head and met my eyes. She had no expression. She just looked. Eventually what happened had become clear. Day-Day had returned to gather her things before departing for Georgia for good, Day-Day's her mother, leaving Felicia and her little brother to live permanently with their grandmother. She'd left with her boyfriend, who Felicia didn't get on with, and she told Felicia, who'd begged to go with her, that she didn't ever want her again, that she'd never wanted her at all. Felicia was suddenly adrift. She had no real interest in my praise, seemed to find it unbearable giving her mother's betrayal, a lie when the truth about her was that she deserved to be abandoned. She made no pretense now of kindness. It was Felicia against the world. She was suspended after tearing the hall papers and then being so wild in class that I sent her to the office again and again, made sure she went directly to Miss Burtonson since I couldn't send her to Winston. After a couple incidents and then a couple of Felicia's absurd tongue lashings, Miss Burtonson told her it was her last strike. A day later, Felicia was back in my classroom with a simple warning. The next time I sent her to the office, she was done for good. Don't be bashful about sending her on now, Miss Burtonson said. Really, it was time to let Felicia go. But Miss Burtonson didn't understand the burden she put on me by making it my decision, allowing me to weigh my own endurance for abuse against Felicia's last chance. For weeks, I tried everything I could. She destroyed my classroom, orchestrating fights, insulting everyone, humming during instruction, making children cry several times a day. I couldn't get through a lesson without a dozen interruptions. I sent her to other teachers' classrooms, but soon enough they had to stop because she was disrupting their teaching as well. I couldn't bear to lose her, but it was obviously unfair now to the rest of my kids. Solomon Simpson summarized the sentiment clearly. As long as she back, Mr. C, can I stay home? One day when we went to the hall to cool off, I turned quickly to when I sent her to the hall to cool off, I turned to the class and told them how we needed to be kind to her, that while we couldn't control her behavior, we could control ourselves. If someone lashes out at you, I told them, you don't have to respond with violence. An eye for an eye just makes the whole world blind, I said, invoking the Gandhi of last resort. But if you let them poke both you eyes out, then you're the blind one, Solomon said. And I had no reply, because he was right. I'd spent all year letting Felicia poke, and now I was asking everyone to sacrifice themselves. I couldn't stop. I broke out every trick I had, cooed, coddled, glared, winked, danced, cajoled, offered rewards and took away privileges, whispered in Felicia's ear and yelled at her in front of the class. As the weeks went on, there was more frustration and less nuance. During my planning period one day, Solomon imitated me at the front of the room, waving a whiteboard pen and pounding the desk for emphasis. Felicia Jackson, that is enough out of you. I already asked you to stop being terrible to everybody in the world 6 times today. It's not okay to poke Serenity in the back of the head, kick poor Solomon in the shins, all the while meddling Serenity and mocking me behind my back all the time, all day, every day. I don't appreciate being called the Ching Chong Chinaman. Ought to go back to China and fry me some rice. No, don't talk. That's a consequence. That's another consequence. No, I don't discuss consequences with 4th graders. Get out of my classroom. Go on, go. I stood there, unsure whether to laugh or cry, recognizing the accuracy of the satire, yet still not knowing how to give up on Felicia. But soon enough, there proved to be nothing that anyone could do. Felicia was put in district alternative school for extreme offenders, children who were involved in serious violence on school grounds or who brought knives or other weapons. Then one day, one man looked out for only 4 children at a time. Within the week, she'd been expelled from alternative school after calling the alternative school teacher a four-eyed pervert and threatening to allege that he'd sexually abused her. The superintendent moved her to the only place that remained, the district in-school suspension, where she was put with other children as old as 20. When the ISS teacher came for Felicia's work, she told me how Felicia had dealt with a 6-foot-tall 18-year-old also in ISS. She put a hand to her hip and waved in the other boy's face and said, "Boy, you ain't nothing, and you ain't never gonna be nothing. You so stupid, dumb kids come around you to feel like they smart enough to live. Ugly, big-headed black boy, go on and try to do something, see what's gonna happen to you. Stay out of my face." 3 days later came the news that Felicia had been kicked out of ISS. Determined to get back at the ISS teacher for some slight, she'd methodically bruised and scratched her own arm, then accused the teacher of abuse, an old trick of hers. She was taken to the police station where the police examiner told her that the injuries were self-inflicted, but the teacher refused to take her back. She was out of options, out of places to go. And later, she actually was sent to another facility for behaviorally disturbed youth in Hattiesburg, and then sent back within a week, because they didn't know how to handle her combination of acuity and defiance. Recently, I found her social media page, and whatever went on in the ensuing decade, Felicia Jackson does not appear to have completed school. As of the year before the printing of this book, she was working at the Sonic drive-thru in Promise, Mississippi. And when I went back to Mississippi, I found out from the other kids that today Felicia Jackson is incarcerated. It's hard to recapture the idealistic fervor I had back in the Delta, before I knew the impossibility of undoing history and injustice by benchmark met and lesson learned. Yet whenever I think of that feverish year with Felicia, I cannot but help but see her as she might have been, shining with rare possibility. I didn't understand that she was burning through that potential at an unsustainable rate, flaring out. I saw only the brightness, and it was blinding, glorious. When I picture her now, everything is impossibly symbolic. I imagine her in a photograph I took the day I brought my camera to class. The photo itself was lost when my camera and computer were stolen later that year. But I remember the occasion of the picture and the frame itself. Felicia had taken the globe on my desk and detached it from its base. She clutched it like a volleyball at her chest, poised to serve. Standing with her back to the window, the day was blindingly bright so that over one shoulder light poured white and erasing, leaving only the dark silhouette of the globe, its oceans and continents spreading beyond her fingers. She was grinning, her eyes bright with mischief and confidence, for she knew full well that she found a way to get my attention. That though I'd be angry she was playing with the globe, I'd have to take a picture with her cradling the world, because the gesture was perfect. Everything was in her grasp. Of those years in the Delta, much is gone, and what remains are moments and images and voices, all of it freighted with the burden of who I was and how I imagined I could achieve. It's impossible not to touch the fever dream of changing the world one lesson at a time, undoing injustice by benchmark met and lessons learned, any more than I can regain the frustrated young man who once tossed a boy out of the classroom door. Mostly now, the children are hard to recall, their faces retreating to shadow, voices receding to clamor. And mostly that absence is the relief, and that silence is a blessing. It means that finally I can let go a little, leave off the harrowing of conscience, rest. The Delta changed me. People think of how idealism ought to be tempered by experience, and they imagine it a benign process of growing older, becoming wiser. They're wrong. You can't restore faith. I wouldn't have been teaching more than a decade now at the University of Oregon if it weren't for those years in the Delta. Would long ago have traded in a Stanford degree for a job with status and pay. Each day in the classroom with 18-year-olds of low-income, diverse background, I see my fourth graders growing up, and for a moment, I imagine I'm speaking directly to the children for whom I wanted so much. Yet back in Promise, the children I taught walk the dusty streets headed nowhere, and I don't have it in me to help them. It isn't work ethic I lack, but the courage to fail again to save a child who doesn't have a fighting chance. And some nights, I lay awake bargaining, trying to get back to the man I was before I went, and I imagine the children a world away in shacks on the wrong side of the tracks, hearing the bark of a stray dog, the far-off whistle of a train. I left them behind, and so I cannot let them go. And if I close my eyes, I can still hear their voices. Come on a pigeon, Mr. C. Hey, how you gonna do me like that? That's not no strike. What the capital of Oregon is, Mr. Copperman? Everybody lives in a tree out there, right? How come you always got to talk so careful, Mr. C? All like, hello, my children. Today is a day when we speak using the words in the dictionary. Mr. Copperman, how come you not black and you not white, but you say you like Nas? Don't you got some Asian person music or something so you ain't stealing folks' music? Mr. Copperman, how you know you don't like a Kool-Aid pickle if you ain't had none? Ooh, look at his face. He doesn't like them pickles. Mr. Copperman, this is a poem I wrote for you. Roses are red, violets is blue. You making a face like you stepped in poo. Man, shoot, that's nothing. That's like half a poem. Here's a real poem. Roses is dead and violets dead too, 'cause I'm on fire and this just burns you. Man, shoot, that's not no poem. You can't use no swear words in no poem. Mr. Copperman, is that a poem? Mr. Copperman, Mr. Copperman, Mr. Cop. And they're with me again, clamoring to be heard, bright-eyed, cheeks shiny, hair shaped close on the boys or braided to tight rows or pulled back clean-in buns on the girls, their uniform polos starched and their khakis belted tight, sitting straight in listening, learning position, or slouching beneath their desks with arms crossed, or buried in a beanbag chair, crouched deep in a kicker stance at the plate on a kickball field, or speaking while doing the heel-toe two-step at a sock hop, beneath the strobing lights, arms and hands waving, faces upraised, demanding my attention, and calling out, joking, declaiming, being absurd and serious and smart, and so full of joy and anger and outrage and curiosity. Such kids. And so it is that the further I am from the Delta, the closer I hear them. Clearer I hear them. Perhaps this nearness is how the past clarifies as it recedes from reach, so that finally what's left is distilled, too perfect to bear. Those kids are, after all, no longer children, but full-grown men and women who have children of their own, and jobs and aspirations and adult burdens. They're no longer my charge, but they're with me as they were, their faces bright and voices loud. And because what happened then is inalterable, it's possible now to love them purely as they were, without the need to have them behave or achieve. Perhaps that's why I've begun to forgive myself for having failed them, because maybe I didn't fail them at all any more than they failed me. They were bright, good kids, beautiful in all they didn't know and all they wanted. The poverty that limited them could be ugly, but they were not. And while I could be ugly in all my frustration and all of the arrogant naivete of youth, I was not such a bad teacher. Not as good as they deserved, but as good of a teacher under the circumstances as I could manage. There was nothing wrong with me or wrong with them. There was so much trauma and trouble and loss along the way that for a decade I couldn't understand why I kept gazing back, mulling over what was gone. It's finally simple. I left a part of my heart in the Delta. Since I left, I've always held back a little, unwilling to risk everything again, the way I did back when I didn't know you couldn't change the world through force of will. A part of me will always remain with those kids, and I'll always yearn to return to them, to be with them once more and hear the cadence of their voices, see their upturned eager faces, and have time for just one more chapter read aloud, one more times table and one more lesson, one last chance to be there with them and so be whole again, to be once more simply and only teacher. Thank you very much.